I've learned that when we talk about the Old Testament and the fathers of the faith, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's very difficult to talk about one particular text in isolation because the text is part of a great story. And so today I'm going to talk about what is most commonly known as Jacob wrestling with a divine being. But this is not simply one of many things that happens in Jacob's life. Jacob, from the time he was in the womb, was not a really nice guy. His name means grabber, and not grab like grabbing something good, but he grabs whatever he wants, and he doesn't care who he hurts along the way. He sees it, he wants it, he grabs it. So in this particular story, we're toward the end of Jacob's life. We're coming to that place where he's seeing the sun set more than he's seeing perhaps the sun rise. And he starts to wonder if those past decisions that he's made are not catching up with him really quickly. So listen now. Perhaps this is a story that's familiar to you. So listen with new ears and a new way of understanding this morning. From Genesis 32. The same night, he, Jacob, got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. If I were to poll all of you here this morning and asked you how much you enjoyed change, I mean really enjoyed changing the way things are, the things that make you most comfortable, if you were really honest, you would say that even when change is for the better, it leaves you with some discomfort. It leaves you feeling diseased. Because change means that something that we're very familiar with, something that has made us comfortable, that we're used to doing, used to seeing, used to experiencing, is no longer the way things are going to be done. And part of our human condition, our heart of hearts, says that what makes us comfortable is good. And isn't that the truth? At some very deep level, we really like to be comfortable. We like to know the boundaries. We like to know what fits in the envelope or in the box. And when things start to change, suddenly the parameters start to change. We're not really sure about the expectations and change. We're not really sure where the boundary line is anymore. And that makes us a little nervous, uncomfortable. After all, why can't we just do it the way we've always done it? Jacob finds himself on the way to a major life change. You see, he's on his way to go meet his brother Esau. Now, Esau and Jacob are not really brothers who get along well. As a matter of fact, Jacob stole Esau's birthright and blessing. At one time, this made Esau so mad he vowed to kill his brother Jacob, so Jacob had to flee. This is not a good sibling relationship here, but Jacob finds himself being called by God to go home. And so home he travels. But on the way there, he starts to remember all the things he did to his brother while they were growing up. And he's filled with fear. And valid fear. This is not fear that is made up in his mind. After all, the last time he saw his brother was going to kill him. And so as he goes home, he starts to think about what that means. What does it mean to go home to a brother that really wants to kill me? What will he do to my family and all the things that I've accumulated in my lifetime? And so on the night that we hear this story, Jacob sends his wife and his children and all his possessions across the river. And he comes back onto his side of the river all alone in the dark of night. And in the dark of night, he starts to think about what's ahead of him. What he's done, what he's failed to do, and what's waiting for him on the other side of that river. When suddenly, in the midst of his own thoughts and his loneliness and in the dark, two hands grab him. Now, I don't know if you've ever had that trick played on you where someone walks into the room and says boo or touches you, but there's that initial jump that you have, that initial fear. Could you imagine being in the dark and believing you're all alone and having two hands grab you? And what's going on in Jacob's head at that moment? Oh my God, who's here? I was alone. I thought I was alone. And then the light bulb comes on as he's trying to get to his feet. My brother Esau has come a day early and has found me, and in this place I will die. He had to be filled with absolute terror. And you know, he could have run. He could have gotten to his feet and ran as fast as he could in another direction. But instead, what Jacob does is he turns and he faces the person who's in front of him. He doesn't run at all. And while he begins this wrestling match, he touches the body of the one who's before him, and he realizes at some point this can't be Esau, because Esau was hairy. That's how he tricked his father, Isaac, out of giving him his birthright. He put on animal skin on his arms and fed his father food, and his father felt his arms and said, "This must be my son Esau." Jacob knew that this was not Esau. He was wrestling. So face to face, he holds on to this stranger who's trying to take his life. And he doesn't let go. Now, I don't know if you know anything about wrestling, and I'm not talking about WWF wrestling that you see on TV, but I'm talking about real Olympic Greco-Roman style wrestling. Wrestling is really not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of discipline and a lot of practice, and there are two things that you know you cannot do if you want to prevail in a match. First, you can never turn your back on your opponent. If you turn your back on your opponent, you're as good as down. And number two, you can never let go of your opponent. You have to be able to do whatever it is you do while you're hanging on with all your strength and all your might. And this, we learn, is what Jacob did with this man who he doesn't know throughout the entire night, hours and hours of pushing and shoving and holding on with all their strength. We're told that Jacob is even wounded in this battle, and yet he never lets go. He never turns his back on his opponent. Face to face, they struggle with one another. And that's our story very often. We struggle with one another and with the things in our lives, the decisions that we have to make, the choices that come before us every single day. We choose whether we are going to turn our backs and run, or whether we're going to hang on and do the hard work that it takes to make our lives and the lives of those around us more full and more meaningful. Certainly, we know that some of the choices that are made in our lives are difficult choices. They don't come easily. Choosing to move away from family and friends and everything that's familiar is a very difficult choice. It causes hours and days and months and weeks of wrestling with whether the choice is a good one or the right one. But it's in choosing to face that change that we learn who we are, that we self-define instead of allowing people around us to define us by their own expectations. We get to set some new expectations for ourselves. Certainly, we know that families that choose to adopt or foster children learn what it means to expand the idea of what is a family. Families are no longer 2 parents and 2.3 children and a dog. Sometimes families are more than that, and it takes a lot of work, hard work, to face the change that fostering or adopting children could mean in your life. Choosing in midlife to change careers because you are tired of just getting a paycheck, and you really want something that allows your gifts and your talents to be used and for you to be filled with joy in the place where you will spend most of your time day in and day out, is a huge wrestling match, and a very difficult one for many people to make. Certainly, those changes don't come easily. But there are other changes corporately that don't come easy either. If you walk down the hallway and you go into the children's wing of this church right now, you will see a whole new children's wing with wonderful artwork and planes hanging from the ceilings and Jeeps in the middle of the room. And some people ask, well, wasn't it good the way it was? Didn't we teach children who Jesus was without having to do all of that? Yes. Yes. It was good enough. It was good enough. But now imagine what those children see when they walk in. Not only do they see people who love them and care for them, but they see visual reminders of what it means to be on a journey with Jesus. Something tangible that they can touch, that they understand at their thinking level. They have large groups and small groups, different than the way that most of us learned who Jesus was in Sunday school. I sat at a little wooden desk with a teacher with a chalkboard. I learned about God. I knew who God was. I understood what happened to Jesus. But most kids today don't even know what a chalkboard is. If we are willing to wrestle with where those children are and what they need, if we're willing to wrestle where young adults are and why they're not here, if we're willing to wrestle with what's happening with Sunday school, and perhaps those classes need some revitalization, if we're willing to face head on and hang on to the hope and the promise that God has for us in all of those ministries and so many other places, if we're willing to let go of the way it's always been done, and look to future possibilities of new life and hope, those possibilities are endless. But it's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit in the box necessarily. But I don't know if I've ever seen a box that fits God's vision for God's church. You know, during that wrestling match, Jacob and this man that are wrestling go on, and I would imagine that they both get pretty exhausted. But at some point, Jacob has this aha moment where he goes, I don't think this is any regular man. You know, after all, he's given me an injury, and all he had to do was touch me. And so Jacob, in Jacob's best ugly way, his best grabber way, without changing his personality in the midst of this wrestling match at all, says, give me a blessing. Not, please give me a blessing, or I know that you're a divine person and I would love for you to bless me. Give me a blessing, it says in the Hebrew. It's a demand. But before that divine being, and could it be God? Divine being says to him, I know your name is Jacob, but no more. No more. You are Israel. You are something new. And then he gets the blessing he asks for. I think sometimes when we get a blessing, we don't see what we've been given. You know, Jacob walks away from that battle limping, right? He's dragging that leg behind him because he can't walk well anymore. But he's limping and blessed. And certainly when we wrestle with some issues, no matter what the issue is, sometimes we feel battered and beat up. But sometimes in the battering and the beating, we get the blessing. We find the blessing in the struggle. We grow, we change, we see the world and other people just a little differently. We might not know what's ahead of us, and we know what's behind us. But we're blessed anyway, with whatever possibilities and promises God has for us. You know, for me, and all the times that I've read this text, I realized at some point that when the divine power, God, said to Jacob, you have to let me go, because God realized that the sun was ready to come up and you can't see God's face and live. So the Bible tells us. Nobody ever let anybody go. Go back and look at that text. It might be implied that somebody let somebody go, but this text never tells us that God let Jacob go, nor does it say that Jacob ever let God go. That's really good news. Because at the end of the day, if we choose to turn and face the change, whatever that change might be, the promise is that even if we're limping away from the battle, God still has a hold of us. And so perhaps what we need to do is not turn our back and run when the going gets rough, when things don't feel the way we want them to feel, when they don't look the way we expect them to look. Perhaps what we have to do is hang on with both hands as tight as we can. And no matter how we end up when it's over, we know that the God who called us to that place is the one who hangs on to us as we walk away. Thanks be to God. Amen.